The monk and the miracle. I was just 2 years old when my health issues started to get really serious. I had fever after fever, and it kept my parents on edge. But one night, when everything was supposed to be calm, something happened that would leave them questioning everything. It was the middle of the night, and I started crying uncontrollably. My parents, exhausted but terrified, rushed to my side and checked my temperature. Sure enough, I had a fever. Panic set in, and without a second thought, they rushed me to the emergency room. The entire drive there was full of dread, but the doctors confirmed once we arrived that there was nothing wrong with me. I was perfectly fine. No fever, no symptoms, just a baby who had been crying for no apparent reason. The relief was immense, but the story didn't end there. On the way home, my parents saw something that still haunts them to this day. As they were driving through the dark, quiet streets, they noticed something strange. There was a Buddhist monk walking alone by the side of the highway. Not a normal sight in the middle of the night, right? The monk was bald, dressed in traditional robes, and he looked completely at peace, walking as if nothing was wrong. My parents, somewhat baffled, stopped the car. They asked him in Mandarin if he needed a ride. To their surprise, the monk smiled and said, "I'm waiting for someone," and then added, "Hurry home, your family is waiting." At first, it seemed like just an odd encounter, a quirky moment in an otherwise stressful night. But that's when the really strange part began. That night, after everything had calmed down, my dad went to sleep, but he had a dream. No, not a normal dream. He was in total darkness, and all he could hear was a disembodied voice saying, "This way, this way, this way," over and over again, as if it was guiding him somewhere. My dad woke up in a cold sweat, feeling uneasy and unsettled. The next morning, something very unusual happened. My dad, who usually took the freeway to work every day, felt an overwhelming impulse to take a different route. Instead of driving his usual path, he took a back road he wasn't accustomed to. The change seemed strange at the time, but it was his gut telling him to go this way. Later that day, my mom saw something on the news that made her stomach drop. The freeway my dad would have taken had been the site of a massive accident. A semi-truck had lost control, causing a crash that tragically killed 6 people. My mom froze, realizing that if my dad had followed his usual route, he could have been right there in the middle of it. My parents were left in a daze, unsure of what to think. Was it just a coincidence? Was it a miracle? The oddness of it all weighed heavily on them, but it didn't end there. My grandmother, who is very spiritual, had a theory. She believed that the monk they saw that night wasn't just some random traveler. She was convinced that the monk was the Buddha himself, guiding my family to safety and blessing us. My parents were skeptical, but they couldn't deny that the sequence of events that followed seemed far too strange to be mere coincidence. The Screaming Woman. This next story is something I'll never forget, and it happened when I was staying at my girlfriend's house in Southwest Florida. At the time, I was 19, and we had been dating for about 2 years. Her neighborhood was pretty quiet. Despite some minor criminal activity and a few run-ins with troublemakers, it was a pretty normal area. Her house backed onto a small golf course, and the neighborhood had 18 houses circled by a road, with houses across from each other. You could easily cut through the backyards to get from one house to another if you didn't feel like walking all the way around. That night, we had gone to bed around midnight as usual, but I woke up a couple of hours later, unsure why. It was dark, and the house was still. I lay there for a moment, trying to fall back asleep, when I suddenly heard something, a scream. But this wasn't an ordinary scream. It was a woman's scream, but it didn't sound like one of distress. This scream sounded like pure rage, almost insane. It was a deep, powerful wail that echoed through the night. And then it repeated, again and again, with short breaks in between. The scream was coming from deep within the neighborhood, but even at that distance, it felt like it was right there, next to the window. I froze, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. This wasn't a typical noise, a woman crying for help, a neighbor yelling, it was something primal. It felt unnatural. I was paralyzed, not by sleep but by fear. My mind raced, but nothing made sense. It was like something out of a horror movie. The scream didn't stop. It kept coming, growing louder and louder, as if it was moving toward our house. My girlfriend woke up, probably sensing the tension in the room. She asked if I was awake, and that's when I told her what I was hearing. The scream seemed to be getting closer, and I knew something was coming our way. It wasn't just a normal scream, it was a force. Something was moving fast through the neighborhood, and it felt like it was running straight toward us. My girlfriend looked at me, terrified, and I told her to be quiet. I didn't want to alert whatever this was. I didn't want it to know we were awake. Then, right outside the window, I heard the unmistakable sound of grass crunching. Whatever was out there was close. The scream stopped for a moment, and for those few seconds, the tension felt unbearable. We both held our breath, waiting. I was certain that whatever it was would find its way to the window. But instead, the scream started up again, this time further down the street, as if it had passed us by. The sound gradually faded as it continued its maddening wail through the neighborhood. We were left in stunned silence, unable to speak, both of us disturbed by what we just experienced. What had just happened? Who, or what, was screaming like that in the middle of the night? And why didn't it stop when it got close to the house? We didn't know, and to this day, we still don't. The time loop in Dublin. Now, this next story took place years ago when I was studying abroad in Dublin, Ireland. It was part of a 2-week language program, and as part of that, we took a trip to a nearby fishing town. It was a weekend, so the town was packed, probably because there was a local festival going on. We had some free time, so my friends and I decided to split up. My best friend, Miles, and I went off together, while our friends Anne and Mary decided to go their own way. Miles and I had a great time exploring, grabbing some food, checking out the shops, and just enjoying the atmosphere. Before long, it was time to head back and meet up with the girls, and we agreed to meet in front of a cafe that had a unique light blue facade. As we were walking toward the cafe, Anne called me. She told me she and Mary were already there, and I told her we were just crossing the street to join them. The sidewalk was crowded with people getting off buses, so we decided to take a shortcut through a narrow alley. When we came out of the alley, the street was eerily quiet. The crowd was significantly thinner, and it felt like the whole street had just emptied. It wasn't necessarily spooky, but it was odd. We shrugged it off, thinking that maybe the buses had just left and the crowds were thinning. We crossed the street, only to find that Anne wasn't in front of the cafe anymore. I pulled out my phone to call her, but there was no signal. Miles checked his phone, and it was the same. We went inside the cafe to look for her, but it was completely empty except for the cashier. The cashier confirmed we were the first customers to come in for a while. We started walking up and down the street, trying to find Anne and Mary, but they were nowhere to be found. After a few minutes, we realized something was off. I suggested we retrace our steps and head back through the alley. Miles agreed, and we quickly crossed back over to where we had been before. When we came out of the alley again, the street was crowded once more, and Anne was standing in front of the cafe like nothing had changed. I called her back, and she answered immediately. She said she had been standing in front of the shop the whole time and that nothing had changed since our last conversation. We laughed it off and joked about having gone through some sort of time loop, but the strangeness of it stuck with us. Looking back, the timing of it all doesn't make sense. We lost a good 20 minutes looking for them, and yet, when we retraced our steps, everything was back to normal. We never spoke much about it afterward. It was too weird, too unexplainable. Before you go, if these chilling stories intrigued you, make sure to check out The Mystery of the Haunted Fort. For just $10, you can dive deeper into the realm of the unknown and unravel the mysteries of a haunted fort that will keep you up at night. Don't miss out on this spine-tingling adventure. Click the link in the description to get your copy now.